1 year ago, almost to the day, the sixth largest earthquake ever recorded tore 500 kilometers of fault off the coast of Kamchatka. It stopped mid-arc, and the piece it left behind has been sitting there ever since, locked, loaded, and waiting. This week, both ends of that unbroken piece started shaking within 36 hours of each other, while the rest of the planet went completely silent. That's not a coincidence you can wave away. That's a fault system telling you where it's going next. Here's what happened this week. Between Monday morning and Tuesday afternoon, the Kuril-Kamchatka arc produced 10 separate earthquakes, every single one of them landing along the same 2,100-kilometer stretch of plate boundary in the Northwest Pacific. The magnitudes ran from 4.5 up to 4.9. 4 of them hit magnitude 4.9. One struck east of the Kuril Islands at a depth of just under 10 kilometers. One landed roughly 200 kilometers southeast of the Russian town of Severokurilsk. Another hit 85 kilometers south of that same town, this one nearly 58 kilometers down. A fourth struck in the Kurils at 76 kilometers depth. 2 more came in at magnitude 4.7, one near Shikotan Island, one in the southern Kurils. 3 additional events filled out the picture at magnitude 4.5 and 4.6, including 2 right on the Japan Trench off the Tohoku coast, which is simply the southern continuation of the same plate boundary. On its own, none of this is remarkable. A magnitude 4.9 on a remote stretch of ocean floor breaks nothing and hurts no one. This arc produces moderate earthquakes constantly because it happens to be one of the most seismically active plate boundaries anywhere on the planet. Before we go any further, it's worth spending 30 seconds on exactly how extreme this boundary is, because the numbers are extreme even measured against the rest of the Pacific. The Kuril-Kamchatka Trench marks the line where the Pacific plate dives beneath the Okhotsk microplate, and the trench floor drops past 10,000 meters below sea level, making it one of the deepest points anywhere on Earth. The two plates are converging at 75 to 80 millimeters a year, among the fastest rates of any subduction zone on the planet. That same engine feeds one of the densest chains of active volcanoes anywhere in the world, running the length of the arc above it. And in the instrumental era, this single boundary has produced at least 3 earthquakes above magnitude, 8.5 in 1950, 2, 1963, and 2025, with a magnitude 8.3 in 2006 close behind. Almost no other subduction zone on Earth comes close to matching that record. What actually got seismologists paying attention this week wasn't any one of these 10 earthquakes. It was all of them together, where they landed, when they landed, and what the rest of the planet happened to be doing at the exact same time. Because when you lay these 10 events out on a map, they arrange themselves in a way that ordinary background seismicity is not supposed to do. They organize into 2 distinct groups. The northern group sits between roughly 49 and 51 degrees north, off the southern coast of Kamchatka, right around the town of Severokurilsk, at the top of the island chain. The southern group sits near 43 degrees north, around Shikotan Island, at the bottom of the chain, extending under the Japan Trench off Tohoku. And between those 2 clusters lies the central stretch of the arc. In this 36-hour window, that central stretch produced almost nothing at all. 2 dense patches of activity separated by hundreds of kilometers of near total silence. If earthquakes scattered randomly along this arc, you would not expect them to sort themselves into 2 tight groups, with an empty gap sitting exactly between them. Random processes do produce clumps, but this isn't ordinary clumpiness, because the location of that quiet middle section is not just any random stretch of fault. It happens to be the one section of this entire boundary that seismologists have been watching more closely than anywhere else on the arc. To understand why that matters, you have to go back almost exactly 1 year. And that is the point where this stops being a story about magnitude 4 earthquakes and becomes something much bigger. There's one more piece of context worth laying out first, because it comes from the global picture and it sharpens everything that follows. Over the past week, worldwide earthquake activity actually dropped. The 7-day global count of earthquakes at magnitude 4.5 or higher fell from 150 down to 126, a decline of 16%. The single largest earthquake recorded anywhere on the planet during this window was a magnitude 5.2, deep inside central Peru, roughly 130 kilometers down inside a subducting slab, and completely unconnected to anything happening in the Northwest Pacific. Nothing. Above magnitude 6 has struck anywhere on Earth in days, and one explanation that always surfaces the moment a cluster like this appears can be ruled out immediately. The sun had nothing to do with it. This burst landed during one of the quietest stretches of space weather all year. Geomagnetic activity sat near the floor of the scale. The solar wind was slow and steady. Background X-ray readings sat at baseline. Whatever organized these earthquakes, it was working from beneath the surface, not from above it. So this burst is not part of some broader global uptick in seismic activity. If anything, the planet as a whole went quiet this week. Against that unusually quiet backdrop, a single arc lighting up with 7 or more events above magnitude of 4.5 in a day and a half stands out the way a lit window stands out on a dark street at night. Whatever is happening along the Kuril-Kamchatka boundary right now is local. The energy being worked on is concentrated there and effectively nowhere else on Earth. Now here is why the exact geography of those two clusters matters more than anything else in this story. On July 29th of last year, 1 year and 5 days before this week's burst, the Kamchatka end of the same plate boundary ruptured in a moment magnitude 8.8 megathrust earthquake. It tied for the 6th largest earthquake ever instrumentally recorded anywhere in the history of seismology. The scale of that event is difficult to fully absorb. The rupture tore along the plate interface for somewhere between 390 and 600 kilometers, depending on which model you look at, across a fault surface up to 200 kilometers wide. In localized patches, the two sides of the fault slipped past each other by 30 to 40 meters. The rupture itself lasted somewhere between 190 and 270 seconds, meaning the fault kept tearing for 3 to 4.5 minutes straight. Studies using back projection of the seismic signal, corroborated by hydroacoustic recordings, show the rupture propagated predominantly southwest from the epicenter, extending roughly 500 kilometers down the arc toward the Kurils. The tsunami that followed was severe along at least 550 kilometers of the southeastern Kamchatka coast and the northern Kurils. Survey teams measured run-ups of 2 to 3 meters at minimum, and more typically 5 to 10 meters. Along 100 kilometers of the Kamchatka coastline, the water reached 10 to 16 meters. In the northern Kuril Islands, it reached as high as 19 meters in places, roughly the height of a 6-story building. Smaller waves crossed the entire Pacific, reaching Japan, Hawaii, and the Americas, and tsunami alerts went out basin-wide within minutes. Remarkably, casualties were minimal, the result of sparse population along the ruptured coastline, effective evacuation procedures, and a rupture geometry that worked in everyone's favor, the aftershock. Sequence behaved exactly the way sequences after great earthquakes are supposed to behave. Within days of the main shock, a magnitude 6.8 struck in the Kuril Islands region, matching a formal aftershock forecast that had been issued after the main shock. Over the following year, the sequence decayed steadily, the way these sequences are supposed to decay. By this summer, the arc had settled into what looked like a completely normal post-megaquake rhythm. Gradually, fewer events, gradually smaller ones. The system slowly working through the largest stress change it had experienced in 70 years. Here's the detail that matters for what happened this week. The rupture propagated southwest down the arc, and then it stopped. It did not break the entire boundary. The section of the interface south of where it quit, running through the central and southern Kurils, has not ruptured. All the strain that section has been accumulating for decades remains locked in place, exactly where it was before last year's earthquake. Seismologists have a specific term for a stretch of fault like that. They call it a gap. And a seismic gap is not an empty space in any meaningful sense. It's a loaded one. The Pacific Plate is diving beneath this arc at 75 to 80 millimeters a year, one of the fastest sustained convergence rates of any subduction zone on the planet. Where the interface is fully locked, that motion stores roughly 1 meter of unreleased slip every 12 to 13 years. The section south of last year's rupture has been storing strain this way for decades at minimum, and it did not let go when the rest of the arc did. There's a second effect layered on top of that steady loading, the textbook consequence that follows every great earthquake. When a magnitude 8.8 releases centuries of accumulated strain along 500 kilometers of fault, the surrounding system doesn't simply relax back to normal. It reorganizes itself. The stress the ruptured section shed doesn't just vanish. A portion of it transfers along the boundary, concentrating specifically at the margins of the rupture, beyond both ends of where it broke. Seismologists call this mechanism Coulomb stress transfer, and its standard signature is elevated earthquake activity right at the edges of a rupture zone for years afterward. One more point about timing belongs here because it's the kind of detail that's either completely meaningless or genuinely meaningful, and there isn't much room in between. This week's burst arrived almost exactly 1 year after the megaquake, July 29th to August 3rd, 370 days apart. Nobody serious claims. Earthquakes keep a calendar. Coincidence remains coincidence until proven otherwise. But the 1 year mark sits roughly in the time scale over which post-seismic processes, afterslip on the fault itself, slow relaxation deep in the mantle beneath it, continue redistributing stress along a boundary after a great rupture. A year out is not late in the life of a magnitude 8.8's aftermath. The surrounding system can still be actively reorganizing itself. In that sense, the timing doesn't prove anything on its own, but it fits the pattern precisely. Now look at this week's map again with all of that in mind. The northern cluster sits at and just beyond the southern edge of last year's rupture zone, exactly where transfer stress should be concentrating according to the physics. The southern cluster sits at the far end of the unruptured section, right where the Kuril arc hands off to the Japan Trench. The two ends of this loaded gap produced earthquakes in the same 36-hour window, while the gap itself stayed almost completely silent, and while the rest of the planet stayed unusually quiet too. The fault system is effectively sketching an outline, and the shape it's drawing traces the one section of itself that hasn't yet failed. And the historical record of this exact arc says that outline deserves to be taken seriously. Subduction zones sometimes fail in sequence, almost like a zipper. One segment ruptures in a great earthquake, and then months or years later, the adjacent segment follows. The most famous example is Sumatra. In December 2004, the magnitude 9.1 Sumatra-Andaman earthquake ruptured and produced the Indian Ocean tsunami. 3 months later, in March 2005, the very next segment to the south failed in a magnitude 8.6 earthquake. Same boundary, adjacent segment, 90 days apart. You don't even have to leave this arc to find the same behavior playing out before. In November 2006, the central Kurils, a section sitting almost exactly between this week's two clusters, produced a magnitude 8.3 thrust earthquake, right on the plate interface. 59 days later, in January 2007, a magnitude 8.1 struck in nearly the same location, on a different structure just seaward of the trench that had been loaded by the first event. One great earthquake manufactured a second great earthquake in under 2 months on the same arc, in the middle section of this same island chain. The 2006 and 2007 pair is worth a closer look, because the mechanism behind it is instructive. The first event was a classic interplate thrust, a megathrust in the truest sense, the two plates lurching past each other along their shared contact surface. The second was something different, an outer rise normal faulting event, a rupture inside the Pacific plate itself, seaward of the trench, where the plate bends downward before it descends into the mantle. The first earthquake changed the stress on that bending region, enough to break it on its own. That's the point worth holding on to. A great rupture doesn't just relieve stress in one place, it moves stress somewhere else, and the places it moves that stress to can fail on their own separate schedule. 59 days was the schedule that time. That precedent is exactly why the question being asked this week isn't paranoid speculation. It's the same question this arc has already answered once in the affirmative, on its own terms. When a 500-kilometer rupture stops partway down a boundary, the section beyond the stopping point becomes the natural candidate for whatever comes next. Whether the wait is measured in days, years, or decades is the part nobody can answer with any certainty. But this arc has already demonstrated it can be measured in weeks, and what the last full-scale rupture of this exact neighborhood did 74 years ago is the reason none of this is abstract. The reference city that keeps appearing in this week's earthquake catalog is Severokurilsk, on Paramashir Island at the northern end of the chain. The official listings literally measure the new earthquakes by their distance from it. 85 kilometers south of Severokurilsk, 204 kilometers southeast of Severokurilsk. There's a grim irony buried in that, because Severokurilsk is the site of the deadliest tsunami in Russian history, produced by this exact same stretch of plate boundary. On November 5th, 1952, at 4:58 in the morning local time, the southern Kamchatka and northern Kuril section of this interface ruptured in an earthquake estimated between magnitude 8.8 and 9.0. It remains, to this day, the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in Russia. Last year's earthquake only tied it. The shaking itself killed relatively few people. No, the Sumseum. Residents of Severokurilsk did exactly what coastal communities are taught to do. They fled to higher ground, and they survived the first wave. Then many of them came back down. They returned to their homes to search for belongings, to look for family members, to see what was left. And the second wave, the largest of three, somewhere between 15 and 18 meters high, caught them in the streets and erased the town completely. The details of that morning have been pieced together from survivor accounts collected decades later. The first wave arrived roughly 45 minutes after the shaking, and it was survivable because most of the town's population was already up on high ground by the time it hit. The interval after that first wave is what turned into the trap. Tsunamis arrive in a series, often separated by tens of minutes, and the later waves are frequently larger than the first one. The people walking back down into Severokurilsk had no way of knowing that, because nothing in their experience and nothing in their government's public guidance had ever told them. The second wave moved through the town at the speed of a fast car. A third wave followed after that. By sunrise, the town functionally no longer existed. The official Soviet death toll was listed at 2,336. Modern estimates run far higher, commonly cited around 8,000, and by some estimates, as many as 14,000. The reason for that massive uncertainty is itself part of the story. The The Soviet government classified the entire disaster. There were no newspaper reports, no published casualty lists, no public record of any kind for decades. A town was destroyed and thousands of people died. And officially, as far as the outside world was concerned, it simply hadn't happened. The true death toll may never be known with any precision. Severokurilsk was eventually rebuilt, partly on higher ground this time. 74 years later, the instruments recording this week's burst of earthquakes are measuring positions by their distance from that same rebuilt town. That is what the full-scale version of this stretch of boundary failing actually looks like when it happens. It isn't a hypothetical scenario dreamed up for a video. It happened within living memory. And the gap sitting between this week's two clusters is right next door to where it happened. The earthquakes in this week's burst weren't all the same type of event, and the differences between them carry real information. Their depths span from just under 10 kilometers all the way down to 76 kilometers. The shallowest events sit at the level of the plate interface itself, the locked contact surface where megathrust earthquakes are born. The events sitting at 50 to 76 kilometers down are something else entirely. Intraslab earthquakes breaking inside the descending Pacific plate as it bends and sinks, redistributing stress. Within the slab itself rather than on the boundary between the two plates. Both populations showed up in the same window this week, and that ambiguity cuts in both directions. If follow-up analysis resolves the shallow events as thrust-type ruptures right on the interface, it strengthens the reading that the locked, loaded section is being pushed toward the top of its cycle. If most of the burst turns out to be adjustment happening inside the sinking slab, it says more about the plate simply flexing at depth than it does about the megathrust zone sitting above it. A useful way to picture the difference is to imagine the subduction zone as a conveyor belt attached to a clutch. The interface, the contact surface between the two plates, is the clutch. When it's locked, the whole system stores energy behind it. The slab underneath is the conveyor, and it flexes and cracks internally as it descends, whether the clutch is locked or not. Intraslab earthquakes are the conveyor creaking under its own strain. Interface earthquakes are the clutch slipping. Only the clutch can produce a magnitude 9 and a Pacific crossing tsunami, which is exactly why the question of which population dominated this week's burst isn't an academic detail. As of this week, the reviewed focal mechanisms for these events hadn't yet been published. They typically appear within days of an event like this. They are, right now, the single most important near-term piece of evidence in this entire story. That's a rare thing in earthquake science, a specific, checkable observation arriving on a known schedule that will materially shift the interpretation one way or the other. The honest statistics need to be stated plainly here, because they're the guardrail on everything else in this video. Roughly 19 out of 20 moderate earthquake clusters are followed by nothing larger at all. The base rate probability that any given cluster turns out to be a foreshock sequence for something bigger within the following days runs around 5 to 6%. Foreshocks are only ever identified after the fact. No instrument on Earth can tag one in advance. The single most likely outcome of this week's burst, by a wide margin, is that it simply fades back into the arc's ordinary background chatter. But the same honesty requires the other half of that sentence too. That identical statement would have been just as true of the moderate earthquakes that preceded nearly every great earthquake in recorded history, right up until the moment the main shock actually arrived. The statistics bound the odds. They don't dismiss the geography. And it's the geography here, the way this burst brackets a known loaded gap exactly 1 year after the rupture that created it, that keeps this from reading as ordinary noise. There's also a volcanic thread woven into this same story, worth pulling on for a moment. Days after last year's magnitude 8.8, the Krasheninnikov volcano on the Kamchatka Peninsula erupted for the first time in 600 years, its last known lava flow dating back to sometime within 40 years of 1463. Around the same window, Kluchevskoy, the most active volcano on the peninsula, also erupted. Neither eruption proves anything on its own. Volcanoes along this arc erupt regularly, regardless of what the megathrust below is doing, but the timing fits a pattern seismologists have documented elsewhere. A great earthquake can shift the stress state of the crust enough to nudge a magma chamber that was already close to critical. It doesn't create the eruption from nothing. It can tip something that was already sitting near the edge. That's one more reason this arc rewards being watched as a single connected system, rather than a list of isolated events that happen to share a coastline. It's also worth being clear about what the modern monitoring network actually consists of, because that infrastructure is the entire reason this arc's story looks so different today than it did in 1952. Seafloor pressure sensors moored across the northern Pacific detect the pressure wave of a tsunami passing overhead in open water, long before it reaches any coastline, and relay that reading by satellite within minutes. Onshore seismic networks in Russia, Japan, and the United States feed data into global catalogs in near real time, which is how a magnitude 4.9 300 kilometers off a remote coastline ends up logged and mapped within minutes. Tsunami warning centers cross-check that seismic data against the buoy network before issuing or lifting an alert. the exact sequence that played out minutes after last year's main shock, sending warnings as far as French Polynesia and the coast of South America. None of that existed in any usable form in 1952. All of it exists now, aimed directly at this stretch of coastline. One claim circulating this week deserves a direct answer: the idea that agencies are quietly hiding earthquakes because seismograph stations visibly detect more small events than the public catalogs end up listing. The real explanation is reporting thresholds, not concealment. Remote oceanic arcs like the Kurils have a practical detection, flow around magnitude 4 to 4.5, and automated detections below the review threshold aren't published until an analyst confirms them by hand. Different agencies apply different cutoffs, which is why one live feed might show 3 events where another shows only 1. And this arc actually supplies its own definitive counterexample, pointing in both directions at once. In 1952, the government really did conceal a disaster. Sealed records, erased casualty lists, a closed state with no outside verification possible. In 2025, that same arc was covered by open global catalogs, publicly posted mechanism solutions, independent tsunami buoys, and Pacific-wide alerts that went out within minutes of the main shock. The infrastructure that hid 1952 no longer exists. The infrastructure that saved lives last year is publicly auditable by anyone with an internet connection. So here's the actual watch list for the coming days and weeks, laid out as specifically as the data allows. The first item is the gap itself. The signal that would meaningfully change this picture is an earthquake of magnitude, 5.5 or larger, carrying a thrust-type interface mechanism located between this week's 2 clusters, inside the central Kurils. That would mean the quiet section is no longer quiet, and stress is finally being worked on inside the gap itself, not just at its 2 edges. As of right now, the center remains silent. There's a concrete number attached to that first criterion, and it comes straight from the loading math. At 75 to 80 millimeters of convergence per year, a locked section that last fully ruptured generations ago is already carrying multiple meters of stored slip deficit. That stored energy doesn't leak away on its own. It waits, and it grows by roughly a meter every 12 to 13 years, until something eventually spends it. The second item on the watch list is the mechanism solutions for this week's events, expected within days of publication. Interface thrust mechanisms would strengthen the loaded segment reading described throughout this video. Mostly, intraslab mechanisms would ease it considerably. The third item is simple persistence. Whether these 2 clusters keep producing events, whether they migrate toward each other, or whether they simply fade out over the coming week. Fading is still the single most likely outcome, and it would quietly close this particular chapter. It's worth ending on what preparedness already looks like along this coastline, because the contrast between 1952 and today is genuinely the most hopeful fact buried inside this entire story. The same stretch of boundary that once killed thousands of people in enforced silence produced a top 6 instrumentally recorded earthquake last year with minimal loss of life, simply because warnings now move faster than water does. If this gap eventually fails, whether that's this year, this decade, or 50 years from now, the tsunami will still be measured in meters, but the response time will be measured in minutes, not in silence, lasting decades. And the difference between those 2 eras is sitting right there in the open monitoring network watching this arc at this very moment. The arc has been sending signals all summer. This week, for the first time in a long time, those signals drew an actual shape. 2 clusters of earthquakes, standing at either end of the last unbroken section of a boundary that has already shown the world twice, exactly what it does when it finally breaks. The mechanism solutions will publish within days. The gap will either stay quiet or it won't. Either way, the instruments are watching, the network is public, and for the first time in this arc's long and often silent history, so is everyone else.